Today it's our last unit on optimizing leisure outcomes. This topic is near and dear to me. This has been the focus of my research, really. My undergrad thesis was on leisure constraints, and my master's as well, and a lot of my PhD and other research. So this is something I find quite interesting. Today we're going to be talking about recognizing leisure opportunities. These are called affordances. And then also looking at interpreting and managing leisure constraints, specifically looking at the leisure constraint theory. Just as there are personality characteristics and psychological dispositions that facilitate leisure behavior, there are also social and physical environmental conditions that are conducive to leisure behavior and affordances and experiences, So these are called affordance. Affordance isn't about money. It's not, can you afford leisure activities? And affordance comes from environmental psychology. And it's viewed as a property of the environment, which can be physical or social, that signals certain opportunities for action. It's a cue in the environment. So this is the environmental model of behavior that identifies characteristics in the environment which we perceive, and these can afford certain behaviors. And this is really Gibson and Greeno have done a lot of research on environmental affordances. So the key word here is that the person has to perceive it to be a property in the environment that calls them to do a certain leisure activity. And we'll go through some examples so that you can kind of understand this a little better. I can understand affordance is a bit of an abstract concept at first. So this chair, what behavior does the chair afford? Most of us, of course, would assume the chair is for sitting. It is a cue to action to sit. So it's an affordance in the environment that we perceive a certain behavior about, and we can sit on this. And I think that's would be the answer that many adults, anyway, would give. The chair affords sitting. But if I look through the eyes of my children, the chair does not just afford sitting. Sure, you can sit, but in our house, chairs are used for hiding, they're for forts, they're for standing on, particularly getting up to the upper cupboards to get, snacks and treats. Every parent knows that, if you hear a chair scraping across the floor, that usually means trouble. But it's climbing. My son, he uses a little chair when he's pretending to be a lion tamer. There's many things that a chair affords, not just sitting. It has many different leisure activities. And often, if you really look at, in my opinion, when you're able to look at the environment through the eyes of a child, you can really start to see then all the different activities that the environment or social environment affords. An affordance is not the opposite of a constraint or barrier. So it's not really like a facilitator necessarily. An affordance can be, in a way, a constraint. Affordance is defined by the constraints as well as the possibilities for action that are present in a particular situation. And what I mean by this is that an affordance could be a barrier in that it is restricting behavior, but in that restriction, you're telling the individual then perceives the behaviors that they can do. And the easiest to think of is a baseball. There are many different rules and boundaries within baseball. The boundaries of a field of play, they circumscribe and thus constrain the action. You're not allowed to, it tells you when a ball is going to be a foul, for example. And the rules, sports rules of a game, they are providing limits, but this so too then affords the behavioral options assumed for participating and for spectating. So it tells us what are the behaviors that we are allowed to do that are afforded in this specific situation. So, boundaries, whether they're behavioral boundaries or physical boundaries, can provide affordance. So creating leisure opportunities for people is often just a matter of helping them see these possibilities, to see the affordances in the environment that are available to them, or in fact arranging such possibilities. It's recognizing and creating leisure affordance that often coincides with managing and negotiating leisure constraints. And just a little example, you often, when you're trying to encourage people to be physically active, they might say, that they don't have time to go to a gym or they don't have the equipment at home. But I don't know about you, but you can, there's many things in your house that afford exercise, whether it's climbing the stairs or, using soup cans as weights. There's many different things in our environment that we can use and be creative with. And I also want to emphasize that an affordance can be physical or social. And we're going to look at some of, physical affordances, and then we'll also further discuss social affordances. It's important to then think about what do different environments, what are the leisure activities that environment affords? What leisure does a river afford? In class, we would do a brainstorming activity of the different things that we might be able to do at a river. The following are things that I have done. I lived for a long time on Rennie's River, and these are the things that we have, well, maybe not all of them, but some of the things that you might think of for a river. Sitting by it, just watching people, watching the birds, exploring the flora and fauna, collecting things, collecting frogs and fish, floating things. It doesn't even have to be a boat. My sons would spend hours at Rennie's River, chucking sticks and watching them float down, playing with rocks, throwing rocks. You can do fishing, rafting, swimming, splashing, having a picnic beside the river. There's many different activities that a river affords. So I've mentioned leisure affordances can also be social in nature. We have to remember that, in our social communication, research suggests that, 80 or 90% of our communication between two people is nonverbal. So it's gestures, it's facial expressions, it's body language. And, you can, if you go into a certain environment and there's a friendly face, that environment then affords a welcoming environment. And so you're more likely then to go into that space for leisure. So creating leisure opportunities is really, as I mentioned, a matter of pointing these possibilities out to people, recognizing that sometimes it's just that people don't perceive affordances, whether they're physical or social, in their environment. And as practitioners, it is up to us then to, attune people to these things. So there's a lot of factors then that might influence how people perceive affordances, or if they even perceive them at all. So several factors do influence if and how a person perceives an affordance. First is, qualities of the environment. These are like opportunities for action and the potential for experience. Obviously, your preferred leisure experience. For example, if you're looking at the river and what leisure activities it affords, if maybe you really enjoy nature, so you're going to think about fishing and exploring the river. Where someone else who perhaps doesn't like those things, they might see the river as affording tubing or boating. Also, the mode or type of activity and the skill level of an individual also influences, their affordance. For example, I see a cliff face. I have terrible climbing abilities, really. I see a cliff face and I don't see it as an affordance. Whereas, for example, Dr. Loeffler, a mountain climber, is going to see a cliff as, an opportunity, an affordance for climbing. And a change in a person's needs or motives doesn't really change the affordance. Remember that affordances really they're kind of static in the environment. We can kind of manipulate the environment, whether it's physical or social. But affordances then are really properties and events that are present in the environment, so they don't really change. But when we help to attune someone to change a person's needs or motives, we may change what the person perceives in the environment among the existing affordances. So again, it really depends on individuals' needs and motives. Maybe we can't change the environment, but we can help attune people to different things. And also, people's characteristics, their actions, and their interactions, especially in social settings, also influence how people perceive affordance. There are obviously strategies then that we can use for increasing people's perceptions of affordances in the environment. The first is reducing or removing constraints and other inhibiting factors, barriers. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next, momentarily after we finish affordances. But we can also do setting and activity management. So that's like altering the environment. You manage the setting and activity to optimize people's interests, their experience, and benefits. Recreation practitioners traditionally are very knowledgeable and good at this. Same with physical educators. It's an asset that many other disciplines don't have. And as an example, think about the physical literacy program that HKR hosts on Saturdays. Play. And think of how that environment is. There's different stations, typically 6. A ball one, a jumping one, fine motor skill one, all these different things. And when the child comes into the gym, that environment, it's no longer just this empty room. The environment is attuning the child to these different activities. So we're managing that gym in order to provide the child with perceiving these leisure opportunities, these physical, or in that case, practicing different physical literacy skills. So leisure service providers or healthcare practitioners, physical educators, kinesiologists, whatever you are, because it's all about some sort of behavior that we're trying to help people maintain. We have to be able to manage the setting and the activity in such a way to optimize interests and for people to experience the benefits. At times, facilitating a leisure experience can be more like a theatrical production. It's really orchestrating the sequence of events that people will experience. And we've talked about this when we talked about different stages of a leisure experience. First is the planning, then is the anticipation, travel to. Then you have the leisure experience, travel back, recollection. Part of it is managing that. And if you think of, there's many examples of for-profit organizations that do this very effectively. One is Disney. The whole thing is facilitating a optimal experience, which you also pay thousands of dollars for. So how do we, what are strategies then for setting and activity management? Well, we can optimization of a leisure setting also involves attending to the social world, for one thing. Providing or increasing perceptions of affordances involves promoting inclusiveness. Having staff with physical disabilities, having staff with who are of different racial backgrounds and ages, that when a client or participant enters that space, there is an affordance, a social affordance in the environment that says, I am welcome. Obviously, that's related to the second point, creating a welcoming environment, saying hello and having greeters and all that sort of thing. And it's also about facilitating social connections. This is, hopefully in this course, you've learned that quite often the way to get people to be physically active and healthy is really through social connection, creating community, getting people to know each other. You should make sure, provide opportunity, whether you're an aquafit instructor, a coach, or any type of leadership role where you're making sure that everyone knows each other and can get to know each other. It's also that high-quality leisure experiences are more likely to occur when personality-environment congruence is created. And what that means is that the environment should fit the person's personality. And also the activity. For example, think of going to a yoga class. They might have candles and soft music. These are cues to action in the environment. They're affordances to say, come and relax. Whereas that is not maybe going to, for a different activity, like trying to get your heart rate up, you're not going to have an environment that is the same. It's also about providing optimal challenge, making sure people are, their skill and their, the challenge of the activity are matched to create flow. Providing feedback. It's also about technology adaptation. So all adapted equipment, adapted physical education, all of these are things to increase perception of affordance. If you think of, the Trek wheelchairs now that, you can go cross country, like hiking and that sort of thing. That is now providing people with an affordance. They are now, instead of seeing a trail as something that they cannot do, it is now an affordance, a possibility. So it's also about, as practitioners, we also have to manage the physical environment so that participants detect this. I mean, you can even think about, you do this for yourself. If I'm trying to increase my walking behavior, it's not a good idea to put my running shoes or hiking shoes, whatever it is, at the back of the closet. That's not a cue to action. One of health behavior change strategies is, you put your shoes in a location, your running shoes in a location that you see all the time, because it provides a cue. And this is very similar then to how we can manage the environment, the physical space. So this is really about attunement. Attunement is an important term for you to understand. It's the process or ability for directed attention, enabling one to detect the features of the environment that are most relevant and meaningful in relation to their abilities and interests. So when we attune someone to detecting features in the environment, then we're increasing their ability to perceive affordances. So the process of attunement allows individuals to perceive certain environmental properties or events as leisure affordances. So we need to help individual people become attuned to these possibilities in the environment. Well, how? Well, we can do leisure education. You could do, and there's a whole course on that, by the way. We have recreation students are required, in therapeutic rec, required to take that course. We have education interventions to identify facilitatory characteristics, so resources and strategies to negotiate and overcome constraints. You can also increase people's skill in specific leisure activities, because that will also help them to be attuned to perceive things more in the environment, and also increasing their awareness of leisure activities and their leisure repertoire. For example, think of someone who has immigrated to Canada from another country. They don't know what snow is. They don't know what are the activities to do in winter. But by increasing awareness of the fact that there's snowshoeing and snowball fights and snowman building and forts and snowshoeing and all the different activities we do in winter, this then creates their ability to become attuned to these and no longer see the snow as a weird environment, but as a leisure affordance. So in class, we would often now brainstorm different types of leisure affordances that we might see in these environments. So here, I'll just think of, the airport. We often don't think of things that you can do in the airport, especially, you get stranded for, many hours sometimes. But, you could do a craft. You could talk to someone. You can go shopping. You can people watch. You can do exercise. I always go for a big walk. You can exercise, you got a lot of space to be able to exercise. Read a book. We could go on. Backyard in the winter. There's a zillion activities that environment affords. Fort building. You can even do painting. I've done that with my kids. We get spray bottles and put food coloring in it, and then you can make art, angels, snowmen. List goes on. And think of all the things you can even do, even in a restricted environment like being in your car. We've all been on family vacations, and you have to think of all the different things that you think of to do to entertain yourself. All different games and singing songs. I don't know why, but I've always made my bucket list. I keep my bucket list in the car and work on that. Check on it once in a while. So again, in your work, no matter what it is, you need to help people to see these opportunities in the environment. In the second part, we are going to speak specifically about interpreting and managing our leisure constraints. So what is a leisure constraint? Well, a leisure constraint is simply any factor that prevents or reduces leisure participation, satisfaction, and interest. And there's been a lot of, an evolution of theory in social psychology of leisure, specifically on leisure constraints. And obviously, this is also used in health psychology, health behavior change, looking at barriers. But in this course, obviously, we're going to be looking at specifically the theory that comes from social psychology of leisure. So first, we're going to look at types of constraints. In the 80s, Crawford and Godby, as well as Edward Jackson, were really looking at how to categorize constraints. So they came up with this typology, that there's 3 types of constraints to leisure: intrapersonal, interpersonal, and structural, which is on the next slide. So intrapersonal, intra means within. So like inside yourself, an individual. So then these are the psychological conditions that arise internal to a person. These could be personality factors. For example, your personality could in a way be a constraint. For example, if you're an introvert, maybe doing something very public or social in nature, that would be a constraint. It could also be your attitudes, emotions, moods, abilities, and knowledge. And so many of these things, some people would also put in some, socio-demographic type things, but these are then usually, psychological. And they are things that often we can, change or modify. And then there are interpersonal constraints. So inter means between at least 2 people, interrelationships. So don't confuse those terms. Intra is within the individual. Inter means between 2 people, at least, so it's social. Interpersonal constraints then arise out of interaction with others, or the lack of others. Could be about family members, friends, coworkers, neighbours. Can also be societal as well, like discrimination. So these are social conflict, lack of a social partner. For example, maybe you really want to play tennis, but you don't have someone to play tennis with. It's difficult, you can't play tennis alone very easily. And lastly are structural constraints. These are things that are external conditions in the environment, not within the individual, not social, but in the environment. And these could be things like the cost of the activity. Maybe it's too expensive. There could be lack of opportunity. For example, in many parts of rural Newfoundland, you might not be able to play hockey because there isn't an arena nearby. This could also be things to do with systematic racism, for example, to do with policies. So there can be many different types of structural constraints. For a person with a disability, it could be lack of accessibility, lack of access to a facility. And these things are, we have to understand too, that structural constraints can become internalized. So and we learned about this when we spoke about learned helplessness and, a locus of causality. When people continuously encounter physical or social or cultural restrictions on their behavior, these structural constraints can eventually become internalized, to become interpersonal. People begin to believe it is them who are limited and not the environment. This happens with gender. There's, for example, a female may experience many constraints in the environment that are saying that, maybe she can't play football. So eventually, because the girl has experienced all these constraints, structural constraints, eventually becomes internalized. And then she changes to be, not that she doesn't, it's not that she can't do it, she thinks that she doesn't want to anymore. So we often, you may think of this yourself. There may be things that in your life that you've struggled with, and eventually what your brain does is you decide that you don't like that. You don't have interest in that anyway. So sometimes we can kind of view lack of interest might not actually be real lack of interest. It might be internalized structural constraints. So the next part of this series, obviously, that when you experience constraints, there's two outcomes. You could have non-participation or reduced quality of experience, but we could also have participation. So early in this field, researchers really assumed that if you experienced a strong barrier or constraint, that it's going to lead to non-participation, that you're just not going to do it. However, we now know that quite often people experience many constraints and obstacles, yet they still participate. So the effect of constraints might not be non-participation. People do negotiate constraints in a variety of ways. So this is the hierarchical model of leisure constraints, developed by Crawford, Jackson, and Godby in 1991. This is suggesting then that we have leisure preferences and that our intrapersonal constraints impact our preferences. Next, they're suggesting that it's a hierarchy, that we then, once we've negotiated intrapersonal constraints, we then negotiate interpersonal or social constraints. And then psychologically, we have this interpersonal compatibility and coordination, kind of seeing, can we actually negotiate all of these different factors? And lastly, we encounter structural constraints, according to this theory. So things in the environment. And then that leads to either participation or non-participation. Now, we actually know research has shown that, in fact, we don't really experience these things in a hierarchy. We're experiencing all of these things. We experience intrapersonal, interpersonal, and structural constraints all at the same time, simultaneously, and they really interact with each other a lot. But we do have many ways then of negotiating constraints. So we have constraint negotiation. So these then are strategies that people use to avoid or reduce the impact of constraints and barriers to leisure, participation, and enjoyment. And this is actually what a lot of my work has been on, is looking at how do people negotiate their barriers. What are they using to overcome? So we can often look at negotiation strategies in different categories. There's cognitive strategies, such as cognitive dissonance reduction. That's actually a therapeutic effect where you're trying to reduce people's, how people, perceive different things, and that will then impact people's behavior. It's easier, for example, to change, in order to change people's behavior, we sometimes have to change the way they perceive things or their motivation. It's also about emphasizing benefits of the activity and as well as the costs, of the constrained activity. And it's also resistance to the power of constraints. It's about your motivation. And we'll talk about that momentarily. The ability, how important you think something is really going to affect how much effort you put into overcoming constraints. Negotiation strategies can also be behavioral, like we might modify aspects of a leisure activity. You might alter the time or frequency of participation. For example, maybe you used to be on a team that practiced 3 times a week, but now that you're in school or have a job, maybe you have lack of time, so you join a league that does 2 times a week. Or perhaps you're no longer doing something for 2 hours, but doing the activity for 45 minutes. You can also modify aspects of other leisure activities, like you might give something up so that you can participate in preferred activities. This is something, certainly in my life course, I've done more and more as I've aged, but especially during family, while I've had young children. You might also modify other aspects of your overall lifestyle. Maybe some people might decide to not have a really big, demanding job so that they have more time for their leisure. It's also about awareness of leisure opportunities and also learning new recreation skills. So, I alluded to the role of motivation in constraint negotiation theory, and this is very important. We know that for motivation, both the initiation and the outcome of negotiation process are dependent on the relative strength of the constraints on participating in an activity and the individual's motivation for participation. This was a proposition put forth by Crawford et al. In 1991. So let's break this down. It means that the initiation, so the starting a behavior, and the outcome, the benefits of it, of the negotiation process, are dependent on how strong the constraints are, but also on the individual's motivation to do that activity. And this is a diagram of this. Don't be, intimidated by it. This is what's called a structural equation model. It's just a type of way of using statistics to examine a theory. In this case, you can see, though, you can see the plus and minus signs. So here, this theory is saying constraints, you can see, negatively has an effect on participation. Constraints, though, does have a positive impact on negotiation strategies. When you have a constraint, it initiates you to use a negotiation. But what Hubbard and Mannell looked at was the next thing they added to this model was looking at motivation. So looking at motivation then impacts negotiation efforts. How much effort we're going to put into something. And the example I like to use is shoveling the snow on a Friday morning, or on a Friday. First, I'll start with the morning. Let's say, it's tons of snow. You look outside, you've got a 9:30 class, you've got to shovel the driveway before you're getting there. How strong is your motive to shovel? Very, very low, okay? However, 12 hours later, and it's because you're meeting friends at 9:30 at night, you're going to be much more motivated to get the snow shoveled, the driveway shoveled, so that, you can go and meet up with your friends. So motivation is the same behavior, same exact behavior, shoveling the driveway. Yet, because of the motivation then changes how much effort we put in. So motivation influences our participation indirectly through its influence on negotiation efforts, meaning that how much effort we're going to put into actually overcoming an obstacle. And people who are more highly motivated are then going to make greater efforts to negotiate the constraints that they encounter. And last, we need to look at the role of efficacy. So this was a lot of my graduate work, was developing this part of constraint negotiation theory. So we've learned about efficacy. Efficacy is how confident you are to do something. So negotiation efficacy is simply how confident an individual is in their ability to successfully negotiate and overcome constraints. So what I was looking at then was, I think of negotiation strategies as like your toolbox, your things of strategies that you can do to be resilient, to overcome obstacles. But sometimes it's not just if you have different strategies you can use, but also how confident are you that those are actually going to help you to overcome that barrier. So you can see here in this model then, simplified, it's the same as Hubbard and Mannell. Constraints leads to, greater constraints leads to less participation. Greater constraints leads to more negotiation strategies being used. And here, in my case, I'll talk about this in a minute, but what I found was that motivation impacted not only our efforts in negotiation, but also had a direct impact on participation itself. But negotiation efficacy, so how confident someone was, the greater their confidence and their ability to effectively use negotiation strategies, the more effort they put into using those strategies. Also, the more confident they were in being able to negotiate barriers, the greater their motivation was to negotiate as well as participate. So, again, repeated. The greater people's confidence in the successful use of negotiation resources to cope with constraints, the greater their motivation and the greater their effort to negotiate, and therefore the higher their level of participation. So, confidence is very important then in our ability to effectively use strategies to overcome constraints, as well as, if you're, it's also about being confident, and that leads you to be more motivated to do something. And last slide, just want to emphasize about overcoming lack of interest. So a lot of times you think that they're not interested. Sometimes we're not. That could be true. Maybe someone just doesn't like a certain activity. But sometimes lack of interest is a very difficult intrapersonal constraint or psychological disposition that you have to deal with when we're helping others. Almost a personality trait sometimes. But we need to really think about, is the lack of interest real? Or is it just that they've never even tried it? For example, one of my friends, she used to always say she didn't like tomatoes, but she'd never even eaten one. Is that lack of interest real? Does the person really not want to participate, or is it due to other factors? Is it because they don't see affordances? Is it because they have barriers? Is it because they are not attuned to the possibilities in the environment? And is this lack of interest due to other priorities? Sometimes it's because, if an activity is not viewed as important to someone, it's not a priority, then it's always going to be. The biggest reasons people give for not doing, let's say, exercise, for example, physical activity, is lack of time. Now, for many people, that's true. But when you look at how people spend their time, do you really have lack of time? Or is it because you've put greater priority in watching, like TV at night and relaxing? So for exam or quiz, it will be important for you to understand affordance. Define and identify affordances. Be able to think, identify and discuss factors that might influence if and how a person perceives an affordance. Also, the strategies for increasing perceptions of affordance. Obviously, this unit, a big part of it is understanding leisure constraint negotiation theory. Be able to identify and explain and discuss all parts of this theory. So you should know the types of constraints and the differences between them. So intrapersonal, and structural. What results from constraints? We know that it can be participation or non-participation. Next is negotiation strategies. We know that if someone experiences constraints, that will trigger often their use of negotiation strategies. So be able to explain the concept of constraint negotiation in relation to constraints and leisure participation. Be able to identify or give examples of cognitive and behavioral strategies that people might use to overcome constraints. Also, make sure, what is the role of motivation in the constraint negotiation process? And by the way, there's a little bit of content in the textbook on this, but this is something that I've primarily presented in this lecture. Also, what's the concept of negotiation efficacy? Again, that's not focused on in the textbook as much, but obviously, since I developed negotiation efficacy, that might be something I'd be interested in examining you on. And then there's some various terms that you should understand.